If it is something that works, study it. If it's something that you think is absolute garbage or you think that this will never work, don't invest time in it.
What's the most efficient path to victory against this particular opponent?
He's dropping off for the choke here. We could see the finish. It's looking tight. Tight as Alpra.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Essential Jiu Jitsu Podcast. My name is Matt Kwan. I'm your host. The Essential Jiu Jitsu Podcast is everything you need to know about Jiu Jitsu. We are back, and today the topic we are going to discuss is benefiting from instructionals. This is something that a couple of people have messaged me about because I am such a big advocate for instructionals and online content and how it can enhance your jiu-jitsu game. So I want to discuss the value of instructionals, how you can utilize them, what is the best way to utilize them, etc. I believe that jiu-jitsu is like an arms race, right? It's a game of knowledge, and it's really, really important to stay on top, stay ahead of all of the current techniques and even the old techniques that have been around forever, but maybe you looked over them as you were going through your journey. This is something that happened to me. I missed my chance to learn a lot of fundamental stuff in my earlier years. You could call it from a lack of, quality instruction. You could also say that it was because I got distracted with fancy upside down inverting stuff, and I really overlooked a lot of fundamental jiu-jitsu game. And then later on in my journey, when I got my black belt, I kind of went back and learned the stuff that I should have learned at the beginning of my journey. And I realized I've been heavily neglecting some really fundamental aspects of jiu-jitsu. But before we do that, please, I ask you to like, share, and subscribe wherever you're watching this show. It really, really helps, and I appreciate it greatly. So let's first discuss what is the value of instructionals. So instructionals provide context, strategy, mechanics, and insight to your jiu-jitsu techniques. I find that, by watching instructionals, you can really, really find finer details that can enhance things that you already do. Or sometimes you're learning an entirely new system. A great example of this was a couple of years ago when I purchased Keenan online for his lapel guard encyclopedia. Now, I'm not a huge lapel player. However, it is effective in the gi, and I wanted to become familiar with the system, so I bought it. I think it was $200. It was a good investment, and I got to absorb that system. Whereas there might also be, Gordon Ryan attacking the legs. I'm already a pretty proficient leg locker, and I'm just looking for those little details that might enhance my game. So it kind of depends what your objective is when you're watching the instructional, who is watching the instructional. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it depends what your purpose for the instructional is. Like I said, jiu-jitsu is an arms race. So every year in jiu-jitsu, we're seeing new techniques at the highest level, whether it's ADCC or Worlds, which is actually going to be happening today. It starts today. We always see new positions, new techniques, new guard passes, new sweeps, all these different things. And because jiu-jitsu is so novel, it's always changing. It's always evolving. First of all, that's one of the reasons why I love jiu-jitsu so much, is because it's never staying still. But because it is always evolving, I think it's so important for the student to stay ahead of the game. And if you see something cool in competition, right away we should be thinking about, how can we study this? How can we learn more about this? We should get to the gym and try this. We should try and systemize this, whatever it may be. A big example of this would be like leg locks, around 8 or 9 years ago, when we would see the young Danaher Death Squad when they were kind of unknown, the Gary Tonins and the Eddie Cummings. We'd see them start to leg lock everyone, and we're like, man, these leg locks are so dangerous. And it was at a time where, if they got a bite on a heel, their opponent would almost instantly tap. And when you have an advantage like this in competition, when you have a weapon that is unstudied and unpracticed, that can be a huge advantage in competition. And so we see things like this in competition. We see things emerge that become incredibly difficult for people to deal with, and it's winning tournaments and super fights and things like that. It's like, man, we got to learn this. This is that's the power of the arm race of jiu-jitsu. And I like to use the term arm race. It's almost like we're comparing jiu-jitsu to military tactics, because of course in military times, when we first saw the machine gun on the scene, when it would have been like over 100 years ago, we saw people with machine guns go into battle and they would just destroy the other army, because the other army has nothing that they can use to compare against a machine gun, right? And before that, maybe it would have been the artillery. Before that, maybe it would have been medieval catapults. And even before that, it would have been things like bow and arrows that would have been absolutely devastating to the opposing forces, who maybe were just armed with blades. So this is just the nature of combat. We always see things progress. We always see technology improve, and jiu-jitsu is no different. We're always seeing new techniques, new positions, new guards, new submissions, new mechanics, and it's exciting. It's something that keeps me passionate and interested. I recommend for every coach, especially if you are a coach of a jiu-jitsu school, you're doing a huge disservice to your own business and to your students by just ignoring current trends. And I see this. Okay, usually it's coaches who are older and kind of at the end of their career as it is, and they're just sort of like, well, I'm coasting. I have a successful business. I'm able to run my business based on my merits, which are things like rank. And while rank is important, you don't want to rely on something like rank, because rank really means nothing if you don't study, if you're not staying up to date with what's current. Because if you don't have that knowledge, if you're not at least aware of what the highest level athletes are doing, you can't really pass that knowledge on to your students, and therefore they could fall victim to these techniques in competition. So I think it's incredibly important for a coach to stay current. Okay. We already discussed learning small details of a system. Maybe it's something you're all really good at. You're really proficient at kimuras. You like to hit kimuras from everywhere. You might want to, and again, I'm going to plug particular instructors in this. You guys know I'm a Danaher Death Squad fanboy, and I like Craig Jones and all these. I like the best guys, right? But if you were to buy like Danaher's Enter the System Kimuras instructional, I guarantee you're going to learn something new about kimuras in that 8 to 10 hour video footage, and you can apply that to your game right away, because you already are so proficient with kimura, and you're just looking for those little small details that can give you a new piece of insight. And you'll go to the gym and realize oh my God, that detail I learned just made my kimura game even way more effective. So now I have this system that's already implanted in my brain, and it's so easy to get 20% better at that system just by watching the best coaches and see what they do in that system and how they approach that, right? Maybe they have some concepts or some techniques that you've never seen before, versus entire systems. For example, the lapel guards, or the leg lock instructional. When Danaher put out his first leg lock instructional, there really wasn't a lot of leg lock stuff out there at the time. I can remember me and Professor Rob kind of troubleshooting leg locks and trying to catch heel hooks on each other, and our mechanics were so wrong, and Professor Rob was one of the first guys to actually put out the modern leg lock formula, right? One of the first guys to have a leg lock instructional. And at the time, I remember there wasn't anything, because the Danaher guys were kind of trying to keep it secret because they were still winning in competition with it. I remember they did not want that knowledge to get out. And then eventually, with enough time and through enough troubleshooting around the world, people started using leg locks and started seeing oh, this works when I do this. And then I think there came a time when Danaher brought the boys together and he said, okay guys, now we've won a bunch of competitions, we've gained notoriety with this leg lock instructional, this leg lock system. We've benefited from in competition, let's now benefit from it financially and make a leg lock instructional. So it was smart for him, because they won their competitions, And then he realized, okay, everyone's catching on to what we're doing. Now I'm going to put out a leg lock instructional. And that's probably his highest selling instructional, I would imagine, because at the time there was almost no leg lock knowledge out there. I was a brown belt at the time, and I can remember looking for stuff on YouTube, and there's just no content on leg locks. We didn't have the mechanics, didn't have the tactics and the concepts and everything. And now everyone's a leg locker. You have to know leg locks now if you're going to succeed at the higher levels. And that all happened in the span of like 5 to 8 years. So that's how fast Jiu Jitsu moves. And if you do not move with it, if you know anything about leg locks, you go into a match with someone who's got leg locks, you don't know anything. It's so easy to get caught, and vice versa. If you're a great leg locker and you're going into a match against someone who doesn't know anything about leg locks, it can be very easy to win that match. It's like an ace in the hole that can always be the great equalizer, or it could just be a huge disadvantage for the other person. That's why it's so important to know things like that. And I always shake my head when I see coaches and competitors who are just like, they don't know anything about leg locks. It's like the old cliche, why ignore 50% of the body? It makes no sense to me. It's like, do you want to lose? Do you want to get put into heel hooks and not have any idea what's going on? Anyways, okay, I believe every practitioner can benefit from instructionals. Doesn't matter if you're a black belt. I've been doing jiu-jitsu for 15 years. I learn so much when I watch instructionals. I haven't been watching them lately, but generally I try to watch at least 10, 15 minutes a day. If you're a beginner, you can benefit greatly from instructionals, obviously, because you kind of have that beginner's mind. You have like a blank slate. So I believe anyone can benefit from instructionals. It doesn't matter what level you are. And I believe that mental study, visualization, studying material, instructionals, etc., podcasts like this one, hopefully you like it. I believe that this is a heavily undervalued and underutilized aspect of your training. Again, if you're only going to the gym and your main source of information is your professor, unless your professor is like Rafa Mendes or Guy Mendes or John Danaher, it's like, honestly, your instructor won't know everything. Okay. There's no instructor in the world that knows everything. And we are so fortunate to have the technology and the resources now to have infinite content. You couldn't study all the instructionals if you bought them all. There's just not enough time in the world, but definitely get on that study train and supplement your physical training with mental training, because it is underutilized and you will notice a huge difference. I'm not saying that mental training is an equal substitute for physical training. I don't believe it is. But it can definitely enhance your overall learning and information retention. And I think it's important to sort of find that balance between physical training and mental training. If you have that mental training as well to supplement your physical training, then when your body's really broken down on certain days, you can go lighter in the gym and exercise your brain more. Or if you're like me and you get injured all the time and you find yourself on the shelf for months at a time and you can't train, I found a great deal of comfort knowing that during the time when I was recovering from my meniscus surgery, that I was able to still improve my knowledge. And when I came back, I realized I'm like more knowledgeable than ever. Excuse me, because I spent this time studying and exercising my brain. So it can really help you in situations like that when you just don't have the ability to train physically. The mental training can really help you stay ahead. Okay. And like I said earlier, if you stay stagnant in a game like this, that's always evolving. You fall behind. This isn't like other martial arts where it's, most of the combinations and most of the attacks have been discovered already, and it's just who can do them best. It's now, you'll see athletes come in with completely different submissions and positions, and people don't have answers for them yet. Another great example would have been like when I started jiu-jitsu around 15 years ago, like deep half guard was super popular, and you would see guys just jump into the deep half guard and the guy on top would have no idea what to do. They're like, holy shit, I'm in the deep half guard. Like, how do I get out of this position? Nowadays, you go to deep half guard, it's like it's kind of considered one of the last lines of defense before you get your guard passed. You know what I mean? And you don't see guys just jump into half guard and play the deep half guard anymore. And I think it's because guard passers have become so effective nowadays. People don't want to put themselves in those positions. So again, the game has changed decade to decade. You see different things. And I'll do a episode on timeless jiu-jitsu probably in the future, and we'll discuss techniques that are kind of timeless and you keep seeing popping up again, like closed guard and things like that. But the game always changes. You always see new themes, and then it tends to revert back to old school techniques here and there. It's very, very interesting watching the trends in jiu-jitsu and every year how the sport sort of changes, right? Understand that not all instructionals are created equal. There are instructionals out there, I think, that are really, really good, and you expect them to be good because it's done by a John Danaher or a Gordon or Craig or Gary Tona, whatever. And then there's instructionals that are very good that are done by no-name people who you may not know about or, specialize in particular things, but they're not really well known in the jiu-jitsu community. Like a great example of this, I just watched a Cain Velasquez chain wrestling instructional, and I really liked it. And he's not really known for his instruction. He's a great wrestler, obviously UFC veteran and UFC champion, but you don't really see him teaching too much unless you go to his, I guess it's American Kickboxing Academy in San Jose, I believe. But he's a great instructor, and I really enjoyed it. Another guy is Georgi Ivanov. He's got a great instructional on hand fighting. I believe it's called Effective Hand Fighting Explained or something like that. And it was awesome. And I don't know who this guy is, but there can be great content. And likewise, there's guys that you expect their instructionals to be good. You watch them and you're like, that was not really that great. It was hard to watch, right? Maybe the presentation wasn't good. Maybe the English wasn't good. I'm not going to name anyone, but just know that not all instructionals are created equal. Okay. And I'll go into the episode talking about like who I think you should watch or who I would recommend watching when you watch instructional, or how to identify what is perceived to be a good instructional, I guess. I already talked about like, your coach not knowing everything, because your coach doesn't know everything. I'm a coach. I don't know everything. And the second that a coach believes that they know everything, that's when they start to decline. That's when you catch them slipping. Okay. That's when ego takes over and they're like, oh, I have enough experience. I have a black belt. I don't need to start. I don't need to study anymore. This is when you start to fall behind. Okay. You always got to have that like beginner's mind, that kaizen mindset, that, that humble mindset. I don't know everything. That's really, really important. Okay. So first I would say, who's watching the instructional, right? If we're going to find out what we should watch, I think beginners should watch fundamental stuff, defensive strategies like pin escapes, things like this, guard fundamentals. Essentially, beginners are a blank slate, and they kind of have a particular beginner's luck. They have like some beginners who are successful. They just react on instinct. Maybe they're athletic. Maybe they have watched grappling or UFC, and they know, oh yeah, I've seen guys do a couple things, and they're very good at just like putting things together on the spot, right? Obviously, other beginners aren't very lucky. Other beginners don't know what they're doing at all, and their performance in the room is not good. So you have to sort of say to yourself, am I good? Do I know things already, and can I complement those things, or am I just like a complete blank slate? I don't know anything. I don't know where to begin. In those cases, I'm always going to recommend defensive instructionals first, guard retention. I like closed guard, although my professor, Rob, he doesn't actually let his students do closed guard until blue belt. It's something I disagree with. And his reasoning for that is because he wants people to focus on open guards so that they can't just lock their opponent in between their legs. They have to use movement and guard retention and things like that. I can understand the logic. I disagree with it, though. And yeah, beginners are essentially, like I said, a blank slate. All right. And to go just to talk about like beginners' luck, as I was talking about, another example would be like when I first started cooking. I realized when I was a couple years in that I was like pretty good at cooking, right? And this skill was coming very, very naturally to me. And I felt super confident in the kitchen, like I could kind of do anything. And like, you throw something at me, okay, I can do it. I felt creative. And then the more that I did cooking, like 5-10 years down the road, I actually lost a lot of that confidence because I realized how much I didn't know, if that makes sense. And jiu-jitsu can sometimes have the same effect. When you're new, you don't know what you don't know, right? And so you kind of feel confident in every situation. You're like, oh yeah, I'm having success against like other white belts and stuff. I feel confident. Like, I feel talented and whatnot. And I know not everyone feels this way, but some people do. You have that like beginner's luck. And then as you do more and more jiu-jitsu, you realize like, oh, there's so much depth to this. The levels are so high that I actually don't know anything at all. And you become aware of what you don't know. And I experience that as a black belt every day because I can get beat up by some of my students, and a lot of them aren't even black belts. So it's like, eventually you start to see, oh, like I don't know everything. If you're an intermediate player, obviously you're going to have like a base foundation. You're going to have some previous knowledge. I would recommend, again, strengthening the fundamentals, but watch what you want to watch. Like if a certain system or position or submission or guard, if something particular interests you, follow that, right? If your body type lends yourself to a particular type of guard or position, pursue that. That's really good to understand what body type you have and what works for you. For example, like particular guards don't work well for me because I'm not long and lanky and my fingers are kind of broken up. So I have to play other positions. I'm kind of tight and compact. Whereas someone who's really lanky might benefit very well from double sleeve or spider or lapel guards, things like that, right? So identify what skill set you have as an intermediate player and start to understand that your body type will lend you better to other types of guards, other types of positions. Pursue those positions, okay? So now let's say you're an advanced player, and an advanced player already has like a pretty wide depth of knowledge in most positions. You should be, if you're considered advanced, whatever that means, you're probably pretty proficient in almost all situations, top or bottom, offensive, defensive, standing, whatever. You're probably kind of just looking for the small details here and there. And I recommend, again, you watch what you want to watch what interests you. When I watch instructionals nowadays, unless it's a completely new system that I've never seen, which does happen. Like recently, I watched Craig Jones' false reap instructional. I didn't know anything about the false reap. I just saw it in training, and then I wanted to see how he does it, etc. But most of the time when I'm watching instructional, I know a lot of the material I'm watching. I've seen it. I can identify with what I'm watching, and then I'm just looking for those little details that can really enhance my game. And I would say for every half hour, maybe I watch of instructionals, I'll get like one solid detail. And that's really all I want, to be honest. Like if I'm watching instructionals for a half hour, I see one detail that I can use right away. It's like, oh, that's the piece that, it made this study session beneficial for me. So that's huge. And it really is, it becomes easier to watch instructionals when you have that base knowledge where you're good in all positions, because it's easy to absorb that one detail. You don't need to absorb everything you're watching in the entire study session, because I find that with mental bandwidth, like my brain, after I hit about the half hour mark, I start to push out information that I got at the beginning of the study session. So I can't retain it all, right? The longer the session goes on, the less I retain. So I only break my studying up in anywhere between 10 minutes to 30 minutes. And I'm just looking for like that one little detail. If I'm watching an instructional and everything's completely new to me, I realize I'm probably going to have to watch it a couple of times. And I realize that my study session generally has to be shorter. And I may even write down notes or try to have little methods that will help me retain the information. Okay. If you're a coach, I think watching instructionals is so important. We already talked about this. your students' styles in jiu-jitsu will trickle down from your ability. Okay. So if you are, let's say you're a fantastic Ashigarami X-guard player, like a Marcelo Garcia, it's probably well assumed that your students will also have that game because they will mimic what their instructor does. And in other ways than just jiu-jitsu, a lot of times people mimic their instructors' mannerisms, they mimic their temperaments and how they treat people and things like this. I've seen this time and time again. So on and off the mats, students tend to mimic instructors. If you're a coach, so important that you really try and offer your students as many different jiu-jitsu styles and as many techniques as you can, especially ones that work at the highest levels. Okay. And if you don't do that, like I said, I think you're doing a disservice to yourself as a business owner and as an instructor. So important for coaches to stay ahead of and sort of build that cutting edge of jiu-jitsu with whatever you think will benefit your competitors and your students. And if you're a coach, I also would say pay attention to what your students are doing in competition, whether they're kids or adults, and sort of bring that knowledge to the gym. Okay, these are solutions to problems that I saw us encounter in competition. I do this for kids all the time, right? I'll be watching kids compete, and then I'll realize that they're in a position where they don't know what to do, and they should know what to do. So I make a little mental note in my brain. Okay, when we go back to the gym, we're going to introduce a deep half guard because that would have helped my student escape mount position. Or, oh, my student made this mistake, so I know that when I go back to the training room on Monday, we need to work on this situation, right? So a lot of the time I like to study things that I can bring to the gym and solve problems that I saw my students encounter. And they didn't have answers, and now the next time they go in, they're going to have answers. Okay. Very similar to coaches, competitors also need to stay ahead of the curve. They're going to be going against students of all different gyms, all different styles, and they need to be at least familiar with certain systems. They don't need to all be expert leg lockers or expert lapel players, but they do need to have an understanding of like how to defend these certain positions so that if they get caught, they know how to at least shut it down. Okay, that's super important. If you're an average Joe who doesn't really like accept the kaizen mindset, who doesn't embrace the, I want to get better every day type thing. If you're just someone you're an average Joe, you don't want to compete, you just want to go to the gym and you don't really care to study, just understand that you will probably progress slower than your peers who do study. And it's not right or wrong. I think it's not optimal, but some people just don't take jiu-jitsu as seriously as me, and that's the reality of it. And that's fine. Okay. Not everyone is in it to become a black belt even, or to become the next Gordon Ryan or the next John Danaher. So just understand that if you don't prioritize studying, if you don't prioritize Kaizen mindset, you're going to be not progressing as fast as other people generally. Okay. Make sure that you kind of have to prioritize your journey. So life gets in the way. You have to prioritize your finances, assess your time. And, you really have to think about how much am I willing to put into my jiu-jitsu journey and what kind of results are realistic for me. If you're only training once a week, be realistic with your goals. You're just there to have fun, make friends, get a workout. That's also fine. Instructors and gym owners, we need students like that to help pay the bills and whatnot. But if you're someone who thinks, okay, I'm going to go in and I'm going to be successful in competition and whatnot, make sure that you're realistic with your goals. Okay. What content should you absorb? So this is subjective. It goes from person to person. Like I mentioned earlier, I believe that everyone should study what they like, and that beginners should generally work on defensive positions, pin escapes, submission escapes, things like that. But generally, I would recommend studying from the best coaches and the best athletes in the world, okay? And sort of see what they're doing. The most successful guys that you see win consistently in competition, look at what they're doing, study the systems that you see work in competition. That is so, so important. Because you have to ask yourself, like, if I'm going to be buying instructionals, maybe you're buying them, maybe you're pirating them, okay? Maybe you have a sweet, sweet source. however you get your hands on instructionals, you have to ask yourself, like, is this worth the money and the time that I'm putting in? And I think of mental training kind of as an investment, similar to a prehab or injury prevention. It's an investment in your journey, in your brain this time, not just your body. And it has to be worth your time and your money that you put in, because instructionals aren't necessarily cheap, right? Okay, free content versus buying instructionals. To be honest, a couple of years ago, there wasn't even that much awesome free content on, say, YouTube. Okay, but over the last couple of years, we've seen a huge explosion of available content on YouTube. A lot of it is fucking awesome. There's tons of stuff you can watch for free. Okay, people are putting out this content now. Everyone wants likes and shares and subscribes, just like you should with this podcast. And so they're trying to put out good content. There's even YouTube pages that are assessing instructionals and assessing what competitors are doing in competition, and then they're making their entire YouTube page based on these breakdowns. One of my favorite pages is Less Impressed, More Involved, and it's amazing. They've really a lot of game-changing insight and effort put into that page. So definitely check out Less Impressed, More Involved. That is a really awesome resource for learning, where this gentleman, I believe his name is Luigi, I forget his last name, he just breaks down like Gordon Ryan's half guard system. So he's obviously watching instructionals, he's paraphrasing what he's watching, putting it into that, and then he's adding competition context and saying, okay, this is what Gordon's doing here. It's like an autistic level of detail that's friggin' awesome. So now there's so much of this free content out there, and there's instructionals you can buy if you want it straight from the source. You could, and you're like, I really love it triangles, but I want to reinvigorate my triangle game. I'm going to get John Danaher's Enter the System triangles. And he's like, here are the 5 central problems when you go for a front triangle. And you're like, oh, holy shit, I didn't even think about the way he systemizes it. Just makes it so much more efficient, so much more clear for me to think about. That's very, very possible that could happen if you study that instructional. And then there's online subscriptions, which you should get the On Guard BJJ online instructional. You can find that. I'll talk about it later on in the podcast, my shameless plug. But there's also many different great online content deals you can get. Like AOJ has some really good online content. I think Marcelo Garcia in Action, it was one of the first online academies that you could check out. Of course, Rob Bernanke's got bjjconcepts.net. Really, really awesome investments. If you really like a particular instructor's style, you can subscribe to their online content and support them and get access to all the great stuff they do. Of course, you could also check out podcasts. So, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm hoping that it's beneficial for you. If it's not, please send me a message and tell me what you'd like to see, because I want it to be as beneficial for your time as possible. But podcasts can give you a lot of context and information that you can learn while you're doing chores around the house, just listening and hearing other people talk. Of course, BJJ Mental Models, which is where I started. My brother Steve has high world-class athletes on his show all the time talking about what they specialize in. I just saw Jonathan Thomas do an episode with Steve about grip fighting from the bottom, and I'm going to listen to that because that's something that I really want to get better at, is grip fighting in the gi from the bottom. So I want to go to one of the best gi guard players in the world, Jonathan Thomas. I always recommend to study and emulate the best coaches and competitors out there. Okay. That's why I like the Gordon Ryan, John Danaher system so much, because they're always winning. And anyone who Danaher coaches seems to be really successful in competition. So I want to know what they're doing, and I want to use what they use. I want to know what kind of weapons they have, and I want to utilize their tools. I also recommend investing in instructors that you enjoy. So if you really, really don't like a particular instructor's teaching style, and believe me, that happens. There's great competitors, and then they get in front of a camera and they try and teach, and it's like, they're not really great instructors. This is actually pretty painful to watch. So in those cases, make sure you're watching instructors that you actually enjoy watching. I know people who say, oh, I can't stand watching John Danaher, he's so boring or whatever. And me, on the other hand, I love watching John Danaher but I do speed it up to like 1.5 speed. And then that's perfect for me. I love his teaching style. Other people don't. So watch who you like, right? Watch who you believe has a good instruction presentation. I guarantee if you do that, you're going to retain information so much better. All right. Okay. So here, study things that you are lacking in. So if you know in the gym that you're always getting your guard passed, or people are always escaping your closed guard, or you get so close to finishing a triangle, but you can't finish the triangle, look to the instructional that specifies in that situation, or watch if there's a particular athlete who is a specialist at that position. That's what I would watch, right? So watch what I rarely recommend people utilizing instructionals watching things that they suck at. Okay. And then that way they can really sort of patch up that hole and fix that part of their game. Alternatively, if you're good at something, watch an instructional of an athlete that specializes that. And then, like I said before, you can sort of pick up those small details here and there through an instructional. Like I said, maybe one detail every half hour, I find, is kind of what I find when I watch instructionals. And then you go to the gym and you take that little detail and you're like, man, that really enhanced my game. Like, I didn't even know I could hit a Kimura from this position, but now I know how to do it. Or I didn't know this dilemma here. There is a dilemma that with this move that I've always used, but I've never used the dilemma with another, where I'm attacking simultaneously another move. And then when you start using that dilemma, you go to the gym and all of a sudden the move that you already knew becomes way more effective. And that is like really exciting. And that's where you see instructionals become incredibly beneficial. You can learn something in a short amount of time that enhances something that you've been doing for years and years and years. And all of a sudden it enhances it to such a higher percentage just learning that little piece of information, right? I already talked about body types. Usually around the blue, purple belt level, you realize, hey, my body type is suited well for this style or this submission, and gravitate towards that. That's very, very important to recognize that your body type doesn't necessarily mean that you can do every single jiu-jitsu position. Accept the reality of that and play to your strengths, but also be aware of your weaknesses. Be aware of what you're not great at, and then try to see, okay, I know I'm not good at this. I know that I'm a shorter guy and I'm not really excellent at like De La Riva X position. I still want to know that position. I still want to know about my shortcomings, but I also understand that it's not like the main guard that I might go to. Okay, this one's really good, and I think that this is kind of like a rule of thumb when you're watching instructionals, and you kind of have to be a nerd to know this. You have to watch current jiu-jitsu. Avoid integrating techniques into your game that you never see work live. There are instructors out there who show moves that you never see work live, and you got to ask yourself, like, okay, if you've never seen this move work at the highest competition level, how do you know it's legit, right? And then a lot of beginners will watch stuff on YouTube or Instagram, and they'll be like, oh, I saw this awesome move and I can't wait to use it. And then I look at it and I'm like, dude, that's never going to fucking work. Like that's not even a real thing. You know what I mean? But a beginner or even somebody who's intermediate might not even see that, right? They might not even think that that's a move that couldn't work. They might just think, oh, I saw it on a screen and therefore I'm going to start using this. So you really have to ask yourself, is this something that will work at the highest level? Is this something that I've seen work live? And that's where you see things like fundamentals always come back into the meta of jiu-jitsu. You're always going to see close guard being effective in the gi and being a position that competitors look to get to, right? Try to do your best, and it depends on the skill level you have, but try to do your best to discern what is effective and what is ineffective. Like I said, if you're like me, if you're 15 years in and you've been training every day for 15 years, it's pretty easy to look at a technique and say, oh yeah, I could see that working. Or being like, that's absolute fugazi garbage. There's no way that that's going to work in competition. For me, I find it somewhat easy most of the time. I can tell if that's something that will work. But for other people, they might not have that knowledge at all. They might look at something and be like, "Hey, I have no idea if that's going to work or not." So you really have to ask yourself and discern through unbiased spectacles: is this something that I could see myself working? And if it is something that works, study it. If it's something that you think is absolute garbage, or you think that this will never work, don't invest time in it. Okay, don't try and incorporate the techniques that we never see work at the highest level and think that they're going to start working for you. Okay, I'm not going to say that those techniques can't work. I'm just going to say, if you're watching an instructional and they're showing techniques that you've never seen anyone do, and if that instructor is a competitor and they've never done it in competition, that's also another red flag. Okay, techniques should work. Assuming you're the same skill and the same body size as your opponent, techniques should work reliably, universally, for a wide variety of people. Okay, so if it's a technique that only works for this guy but doesn't work for that guy, doesn't mean that you're going to be able to absorb it in your game. Okay. I already talked about, like, if you're a coach and you see something that your students are lacking in, like there's a big hole in your overall team's game, maybe they're all lacking in like leg lock knowledge. That's a big indication that as a coach, you should be like, hey, we need to start studying leg locks, because we're getting leg locked in competition. And every time someone just touches one of my students' feet, they just tap out, and we can't have that. Right. And this still happens. I can't believe that there are coaches out there who just like allow their students to have such big gaping holes in their game. And they're like, yeah, well, whatever. It's like, what am I, a coach? Yes, you're the fucking coach. You should be the one who brings that system in and knowledge, and imparts that knowledge on your students. So if you're seeing your students lacking in any particular systems, that's a good indication. Hey, we need to study this stuff, right? Okay. So what if you find instructionals boring? And this is something that I hear all the time. I'm like, hey, did you study? And they're like, no, man, like, I don't care. It's boring to me. I don't want to sit in front of a screen and watch. Fair enough. Okay. That is fair. Again, I disagree with it. I would recommend that you try and at least get 10 minutes a day if possible. Okay. If you find the instructor boring, find a different instructor to watch. But what else could you watch? You could watch competition footage. You could watch short clips like reels on Instagram and on YouTube. Jason Rao, under Matt Serra, BJJ, he's recently put out some content on Instagram. He puts out these they're like 10-second clips, 5-second clips, 15-second clips, just like little concepts, little techniques. Amazing page. I love the stuff he's putting out. I really like Jason Rao's Instagram page. He puts out daily clips. Another guy I really like, Jonathan Thomas. Of course, I mentioned him before. He has these concepts. He's more of a gi guy. Jason Rao's primarily a no-gi guy. There's another guy I really like, gi guy Sebastian Serpa. I actually saw him on Jonathan Thomas's page and I followed him, and he's got awesome stuff too. So like, if you can't sit in front of an instructional because you find it boring, that's okay. Try to find other resources of jiu-jitsu that you can watch. Sometimes it's Instagram reels, sometimes YouTube videos, sometimes it's just watching competition matches and observing the athletes and seeing what they see. If you can, try and watch jiu-jitsu through other means if you can't sit in front of an instructional. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to say is to study the rules. The rule sets: ADCC, IBJJF tutorials on YouTube. I've talked about this YouTube channel. I think it's very, very effective for those who want to become good competitors, coaches, and referees. Okay, what's the best way to study? This is one of the most common questions I get asked about instructionals is, how do you study, Matt? Like, do you just watch it and you absorb the knowledge? And the short answer, yeah, I have like a pretty good memory. And because I'm pretty knowledgeable in jiu-jitsu, not to toot my own horn, okay, I'm no Rafa Mendes, I'm no John Danaher, but I'm somewhat knowledgeable. I've watched a lot of content, I've studied a lot, I dedicate my life to jiu-jitsu. So for me, it's easier to study than someone who's a blue belt, because I already have a base level of knowledge. I can just take in little details as they come And then I know when to turn my brain off. When I've watched enough, I'm like, okay, I've watched enough. I turn it off now. I go do something else. Let my brain sort of heal, because that's what we're doing. We're exercising our brain. So I have to now let my brain rest and try and file away the information that I've retained. If I overdo it, if I watch too much content, then my mental bandwidth kind of runs it gets overstretched and I can't retain anything anymore and I start to lose information. So I don't want that. That's like a negative return, right? So know when to turn off the instructional. I also recommend that you kind of like ask yourself, what kind of a learner are you? In culinary arts, I was always the kind of learner that needed to do something. I could observe someone do something and I would see the result that they got when they made whatever, a dish or a sauce or a dessert or whatever. And then my job in my mind was to mimic that as effectively as possible. So I would look at the process of the instructor cooking the item or whatever. This is when I'm first learning how to cook. And I would try and mimic what they did. And I tried to pay attention to the small details of what yielded the result that was desirable. And in that way, I was actually pretty successful. So I'm a visual learner and I'm a hands-on learner myself. So I can watch an instructional and sort of visualize what the technique feels like. Okay. And that really helps me to hammer it home too. When I'm watching instructional, sometimes I'll just pause it and I'll think. I'll be like, okay, if I was in that position, what would that feel like? Oh, okay. I can sort of sense what that position would feel like. I visualized it before. So I like to visualize and imagine what that result feels like. Another example of when I was cooking is I became proficient in cooking and so aware of my palate that I could look at a recipe and I hate recipes, by the way. I never use them, but I do use them as a reference guide. Like I would look at a recipe and be like, okay, yeah, I can see how long it's cooked for. I can see the ingredients that are in there. I could visualize what the dish tasted like just by looking at the recipe. And just like jiu-jitsu, I could feel the move just by watching the technique. And this is where you get to a level where it's like I'm aware so much with what I'm trying to learn. It becomes very easy to plug in little details here and there. If you're going in and you're like, I have no idea how to scramble eggs, and you try and cook a souffle, it's like you're gonna fuck it up. Okay, and through trial and error and fucking it up enough times, hopefully you can make adjustments that actually yield a beautiful souffle or whatever. So a lot of that, you have to ask yourself, what kind of a learner am I? What kind of learning tools do I use in my head? For me, I love visualization, hands-on, and mimicking, watching. Okay, this is sort of how I learn. But other people I know can't do that. Other people need to take notes. Some people have, little cue cards that they like to mix up and make random, and they test themselves. Nothing wrong with that, okay? Sometimes I'll take notes if I'm watching an instructional that's entirely new content for me. I will take notes on it, and then I will look back on the notes, and writing things out I find also helps me retain information. Like when I'm watching something unorthodox, Craig Jones' Power Ride was a really cool instructional because he talks about pinning and controlling, but from completely unconventional jiu-jitsu positions. He's talking like, yeah, you could mount someone or you could take someone's back, but if you do that, you actually allow them to get their feet on the floor and start to generate movement. And when you could just leg ride them, you could use, you could Turk their leg, you could leg ride, you could do all these different types of hold down positions that are unconventional in jiu-jitsu, and they don't necessarily score points, but they do a great job of controlling someone. So, that was really interesting for me. And when I watched that instructional, I made sure that I took notes, right? I just got my kitties here with me. That's Clay, by the way. He's the gray one. Raj is the black one. Okay, so taking notes, like I talked about, I find benefit in writing notes down. I think that helps me retain knowledge. Another thing to think about is like, do you want to observe chapters when you watch instructionals, or do you want to watch the entire instructional from start to finish? I do both. Sometimes I watch an instructional from start to finish and I break it down into, like I said, half-hour sessions. Sometimes I will skip right to the end and see the last chapter that is on the instructional, and then I'll kind of watch it backwards. Other times I will pick and choose here and there. I actually have a document in my notepad that called BJJ Instructionals, where I literally have like 30 different instructionals, and it's like a bookmark where it says, okay, you've been watching Craig Jones Power Ride. You are on chapter 3, 35 minutes in, or you are on Nicky Rod Body Lock. You're on chapter 2, 10 minutes in, so that I have my place in there. And that way I kind of know what I'm watching and where I am. So when I go back to that instructional, I can pick up where I've left off. I don't necessarily always watch entire instructionals start to finish, because I find that's not always the best way to retain knowledge. I find most of the time I like to go back and forth and then rewatch chapters, especially if it's brand new content. I like to rewatch chapters. Sometimes what I'll do too, and I have students who do this when they're watching instructionals, is they record small clips on their phone. So if you see something, I can remember I was watching a John Danaher submission escapes, and was it John Danaher? It might have been actually Get Off My Legs Gringo. I've seen them actually both do this escape. It's the saddle escape, the redirection escape. It's a tricky technique. It's one of the most tricky techniques I've ever seen. And if you wanted to have a reference for when we saw this in live competition, it's when Gordon Ryan got his back taken from Felipe Pena. Pena sort of did that like hip sit out switch position and escaped the saddle and took the back. And in doing so, there's some danger there. You can get your knee caught and get knee barred or get caught in a heel hook. So you kind of have to really sell this misdirection technique in order to get there. And when I saw them show that on the instructional, I made a clip of it on my phone because I wanted to have that clip with me. So when I went to the gym, I could watch it and then try it, and watch it and then try it. Like I said, incredibly difficult technique to do live, and you have to have some guts to do it. We saw Pena try to do it to Tex Johnson, and he got heel hooked by Tex Johnson. So it doesn't work all the time, but it did work on Gordon twice. Just saying. Let's talk about this. So the playback speed pros and cons. So like when you're watching instructionals, the pros and cons to watching things fast versus watching them at a regular pace. So if you watch an instructional at a regular pace, yes, it'll be slower. Like sometimes you watch John Danaher and it's kind of slow. And you speed it up and it goes by a lot quicker. And for me, it's a lot easier to listen to. However, when you watch things slow, I find you actually retain more knowledge. For me personally, when I speed things up, sometimes it's easy to kind of skip over quality parts in the instructional. So I will say that I find when I speed things up, it's harder for me to retain knowledge, but I get through it quicker. When I slow things down, it's easier to retain knowledge, but it takes more time. Okay. So I find pros and cons with playback speed, speeding them up and slowing things down. Generally, I try and speed things up to 1.5 because I got shit to do and I'm trying to be as efficient as I can with my time. All right. My cat is like really taking liberties right now. Hold on. Just gonna. I just literally threw him halfway across the room. He's good. Okay. How long should each study session be? Like I said, I wouldn't go longer than 30 minutes unless you are an autist who can handle all of that information and not burn out. For me, I can't. Just respect your mental bandwidth, as we talked about. If you feel that your brain's getting tired, if you feel like you can't remember what you first started watching at the beginning of the study session, turn it off. That's a good indication for me. I've studied too much. I would also recommend that wherever you train, that you encourage your teammates to study so that you can collaborate together. You can say, hey, I'm working on this. What are you learning these days? Right? And have that kaizen mindset. I have that at my gym right now. And it's a really cool environment to be in because everyone's trying to get as much knowledge as they can. They see the value of study. They see that jiu-jitsu is an arms race and they're all working collectively. Even though they're studying different things, we can all come together and collaborate and be like, hey, I saw this really cool saddle escape. Check this out. Oh, I had no idea. Oh, check out this, check out how Danaher goes right from this pin into this attack, right? And it's like it cultivates a cool environment in your gym when everyone's on the same page that way. As opposed to everyone being like, oh, Professor Matt hasn't taught that yet, so therefore I don't know it. I'm waiting for him to spoon feed me all the information, right? empower your students, empower your teammates, and say, hey, go on your own and study when you're not here, so that you can come in and we can all get better, right? All right. What if your instructor doesn't study at all? This is common. It happens. You really have to look at your instructor and ask yourself, am I spending my time and my money well? Okay. Not all instructors are created equal. Make sure that you are, if you're investing your time and your money into something like jiu-jitsu, you're going to jiu-jitsu multiple times a week for decades to come. Be critical of your instructor. Be critical of the environment. That's why I try to do my best to stay ahead, because I know that if someone opens up down the street and they're better than me, my students should go to them. Okay. And this is the reality of it. My students shouldn't stay with me just because of honor or loyalty or whatever. It's a free market at the end of the day. And if someone moves down the street who is much better than me, I need to find a reason to make my instructor, my students stay with me aside from loyalty. Okay. And that's why it's so important to stay ahead, because if your instructor doesn't study, well, it's going to be tough, right? Okay. Coaches. So for coaches, getting information from instructionals and then passing it to your students. So important. I would recommend to really learn something, don't try and regurgitate it the way that you saw in the instructional. Paraphrase it, use your own presentation as an instructor, and try to pass it on to your students that way. And little by little, you can't just regurgitate Gordon Ryan enter the system, or sorry, that's John Danaher's instructional. If you watch a Gordon Ryan instructional, don't teach it the way exactly Gordon would teach it, okay? Use things that he uses to make it good information, but at the end of the day, you have to be the instructor and find a way to create a presentation where the knowledge that you learned on the videotape can get to your students in a clear and concise way. Super important. We already discussed if your team is lacking in certain things, that's usually an indication as to what they should learn next, right? Make sure that you're taking information in accurately, condense it, and then pass it on effectively to students. And this sometimes can be difficult. Do I want to just show them techniques? Do I want to develop like games like Greg Souders and develop games and do sort of like a live drilling or a live resistance style sparring to incorporate the information that you're learning? Or are you just trying to show the technique and hope that they get it, right? There's so many ways to pass on information. I find a mixture of both is important. And when I have Greg on the show in the upcoming weeks, we're going to discuss this ecological approach versus, technique-based approach or traditional learning-based approach in jiu-jitsu. Understand that like not all students learn in the same way. Like I said earlier, please, if you're a student, try to think, what's the best way that I can learn? What is my learning style? Am I hands-on? Do I learn by watching? Do I learn by listening? Do I learn by writing down notes? Sometimes students write down notes. Okay, I've never been that guy, but sometimes that is a great way to learn. Not everyone will learn in the same way, and it's important to know the strength, to understand your students' strengths and weaknesses, and to sort of think what's the best way they're going to get the information. Okay. Also, your lessons as a coach need to be based around what's realistic given who you're teaching. If you look around, you're doing a group of fundamental students who've never trained before, you're not going to be going into barambolos and leg locks likely. You're probably going to be focusing on pins and guard retention and things like that. If you're in a group full of kids ages 5 to 9, you're probably going to be focusing on basic stuff. The way you teach is going to be very simplified and very to the point, and you're going to be looking to get good discipline and good behavior and create good character in these kids, as opposed to getting them to, like I said, do lapel guards and barambolos. However, if you have more of an advanced group of kids who actually have jiu-jitsu skills, now we can go into more of the fun stuff. We can teach them stuff that is more current and more meta, and we can treat them more like adults, right? So you kind of have to plan your lesson around the ability and the crowd, the ability of your students, and look at what's realistic. What's the target goal as the coach, and how can I teach and what can I teach to reach that target, right? I'm not going to teach my young kids exactly how I teach adults, but the teens the kids who are ages 10 to 14, I probably will teach more like adults. Treat them like adults. It's amazing what they can do. Okay, we discussed about the Greg Souders approach. We made a brief mention about game-based approach and things like that. I think that that's a great way to transfer situational knowledge in a short amount of time. So I'm a huge fan of that. And moving forward, I'm not going to say that that's the end-all be-all as an instructor, but I am going to say that that is a very important way to coach, okay? Because it adds live resistance in these specific positions. We'll definitely be talking to Greg about that in the future on the show. I like to prioritize tactics, mechanics, timing, and strategy for any technique. So any technique I'm teaching, I want to incorporate these aspects. What are the tactics around it, right? How are we going to get there? What are the mechanics around it? What makes the move work? What is the timing around it? How can I off balance my opponent so that they're weak? And in that moment, that's the time that I'm going to use it. The strategy of any given technique that I'm going to teach. I like to think, how is this going to fit into an overall match, right? A 10-minute match. When is this going to come into play? How can I use what I'm teaching to my advantage? Okay. So when you're passing on instructional knowledge to your students, think about these things. Okay, we're running out of time. I'm going to be real quick here. Making time for study, create a routine. This is so important. So it's hard to find time in the day to do this. Okay, when you get home, try to watch instructional for 5 minutes. Try to make a routine of it. If you can make a routine, that is the good habits, the healthy habits. That is like the birth of knowledge and results. So create good habits for study. Try to create consistency through routine, and through time, you start to see results. Just understand that every practitioner who has a job wishes they had more time for jiu-jitsu. You're not alone when you're like, Matt, how the fuck am I going to study when I got kids? I got a job. I can barely get to jiu-jitsu. How am I going to study? Try to take 5 minutes a day. Try to put 5 minutes aside a day where you can study. Okay, really, really important. Have that kaizen mindset. Like, okay, did I learn something new today? If I didn't, I need to learn something new today, right? Don't rely on your instructor to show you everything. Think about external sources to learn things, because the hardest time is committing. The hardest thing is committing time to study. That is the hardest part. Just when you sit down, you're in front of your computer, you're there. You did it, right? It's getting there. That's the hard part. So make sure that you make that a routine. Most people do not prioritize mental training. So like I said, I think it's low-hanging fruit to be able to do this and to be able to put aside time to do that. Try to find like 10 minutes a day where you have like a little pocket of time to mentally study, if that's all you can do. If you're like me and jiu-jitsu is your life, hopefully you have more time to study, and it really, the small sessions really do add up. That consistency always add up. I think every instructor needs to study personally. Because otherwise, what the fuck are you teaching your students, right? Stuff that you like, stuff that that you think will work. Make sure it's tried, tested, and true content. That's my recommendation for all instructors. Last but not least, okay, did studying help me? So I always like to look back at my growth. I like to measure my own growth and my team's growth as a coach, and look back after a couple of months of doing a particular module or a position, or maybe you're like me, you're using the Greg Souders ecological approach. I'm now a month in, and soon I'll be sharing my findings with that approach. And ask yourself, like, was it beneficial? Because if it wasn't, how could I make it more beneficial? If there's no way that there's any fruit with this new type of style, if it's not fruitful at all, maybe I'll do something else. Okay. And do you feel more, after studying, do you feel more qualified, more knowledgeable to instruct your students on any given topic now that you've studied? This is really important to think about too. I always ask myself, like, okay, what did I learn from watching this instructional? And do I feel more confident bringing it to the training room and showing my students with it? The answer is pretty much always yes, in my case. Okay. And most instructionals, for me, take multiple times to watch it to absorb it, because we're talking about like sometimes 8, 9, 10 hour instructionals. If you're watching Gordon and John Danaher, and so much information, a lot of the time I'll watch back again and I'll be like, oh yeah, I forgot that detail. And then just watching it again will really help me hammer it home. So sometimes, be prepared for instructionals to take multiple times to study and absorb. Okay, and competitors, ask yourself after you watch instructionals, did those instructionals come in handy when you're in competition, when it matters most? That's really, really important to understand. If it didn't, ask yourself why. Are the techniques not good? Were you able to do the techniques at all? Or were the techniques you tried to do, did they fall flat completely in competition? Do they need more repetitions, or are they just techniques that maybe aren't suited for your body type? These are all things that you have to assess after you spend a significant period of time studying as a competitor. And of course, how do these skills that you've tried to absorb in instructionals, how do they translate to the mats in your academy? Are they working against your teammates and other students in the gym of your size and skill? If they are, that's a good indication that the instructional was beneficial. Okay. All right, guys, we're running over time here. I hope you learned something today, and I hope you get studying. And let me know in the comments wherever you're listening to this. I'm going to tell you how to contact the show in a moment here. Let me know if you do have a good benefit from instructionals, or if you found they didn't help you at all. I think there's going to be very, very few people who say they watched instructionals and it didn't help them at all, because if you can prioritize that mental training, there's almost always some kind of benefit to it. Now I'd like to tell you how to contact and support the show. Of course, you can check out my website, ejjp.show. You can check out Instagram. I have an Instagram page. It is at the Essential Jiu-Jitsu Podcast. And you can message me there. You can also message me at ejjpod@gmail.com. You can email me, give me show ideas, ask me questions. If you want to support the show, please subscribe to my online academy. If you like how I talk about jiu-jitsu, if you like my teaching style, On Guard Online Academy, you can check that out at onguardbjj.com. Just click on the online academy link. It's $10 a month. I put out daily content, and I'm revamping my BJJ fundamentals section right now. I'm putting in a bunch of new videos. That'll probably take me, I'll probably be doing this ongoing, but I just put a bunch of new content up. Check that out. And last but not least, I have a kid's book. It's called Zara Can Do Jiu-Jitsu. My daughter, Zara, she does jiu-jitsu with me. We're going to be training later today in the gi. And jiu-jitsu is a great sport for kids. And this book talks about the trials and tribulations of jiu-jitsu for kids, the ups and downs of training, how hard it is, how fun it is, and some pretty awesome illustrations as well. There's a good meaning behind it. It's a family book. It's good times. You can get that on Friesen Press. You can get it on Amazon, wherever fine books are sold. And that is our show today, guys, benefiting from instructional. So in conclusion, I hope you study, and I hope you embrace the mental aspect of jiu-jitsu, because it is such a mental game. And I will see you next week on the Essential Jiu-Jitsu Podcast, because remember, the Essential Jiu-Jitsu Podcast is everything you need to know about jiu-jitsu. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. See you next time. Bye.